Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Future of Faith podcast. I've got Keedren, Boston here with me as always.
Sir,
Keedren, how you doing today?
I'm great, man. How about yourself?
I'm doing really good. Uh, it's nice to be here with you, and it's always fun to talk about these data and hear sort of how it gets filtered. From my lens as somebody who thinks about spreadsheets and national level trends, how this gets filtered in through your eyes on the ground is I think like it adds this dimension of truth to how I see the world and understand it that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. So I'm really excited because this is one of my favorite I think one of the things to talk about and what I think is one of the most important episodes in this whole season. We've been unpacking all this data and research that we've done around listening and faith formation. But we wanted to spend one episode here sort of talking about what else happens when you listen besides deepening somebody's faith. And we've talked about this in pieces throughout the season. But one of the key things is that it helps to establish and deepen your trust with somebody when you actually listen with intent, when you're relatable, reliable, and curious, all things we've been talking about, when you don't do any of those 5 things plus the bonus that we spent in the last episode talking about. And this issue of trust is actually really, really critical because there's been this thing unfolding in our country that most people don't realize or recognize, not because they're not smart enough to, but because they've just never, had the opportunity to see the data this way. And it wasn't until I started looking at it for a class I was prepping, 10 years ago, that I started to understand how impactful this was. And this trend is the decline of institutional trust. So, when we in places like Gallup and Pew, General Social Survey, we've been asking Americans this question for over 50 years. Rate your level of trust for the military, for the U.S. government, for schools, for medical profession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And usually the thing that we end up feeling most is what's just in our sector. So if you work in ministry, you think like, man, it seems really a lot harder to do my job. Maybe people don't trust me anymore. If you're a doctor, you're like, why don't people, my people seem to trust my dad when he was a doctor a lot more than they trust me or something, right?
Yeah.
And I think they're living inside of this trust story that is about their industry. But the reality is that they're living inside of a trust story that is about institutions generally. And it hasn't been like abrupt. It's been just a little bit every year that we've just seen this erosion of trust in our basic social institutions. So that now trust levels for institutions are at literally, I'm not even exaggerating, they're at all-time lows. And even when we ask questions about the professionals operating inside of those institutions, which again, you can go and find all this at Gallup or wherever, you can Google for it very easily. I think they just rerun the same headline every year because the results are like, oh, now clergy and doctors and police officers are at an all-time low, which they were last year. It's just that it went down even more. So it's like the extension of institutional mistrust to the professionals that occupy those official positions too. What's sort of bizarrely wrapped up in all this is that while people don't trust Congress, they do trust the congressperson they voted for. They don't trust the education system, but they like their teachers, right? They don't trust, organized religion, but they do trust their pastor. And this is what we get to with listening, is that while institutional trust and positional authority trust is at an all-time low, what that is being backfilled with is not just like plain skepticism. It's being backfilled with trust for more individual personal relationships. So here's how we saw this show up in our data. And then Keedren, I'd love to know from you sort of how you see this like impacting or influencing the way that you all have evolved to do ministry in this relational style. So in our data, what we asked people, adults and teens, I'll give you the 2 numbers side by side. What is your trust for large corporations? 26% of adults said they had high trust. What about leaders and bosses? 32% of adults said they trusted them. 26% of teens said they trust leaders and bosses. What about social media influencers? 23% of adults said they trust influencers. Only 15% of teens. They get it. They see it.
You get it.
But then we asked, okay, what about people you have a relationship with? 70% of adults said they trust those people. 76% of teens said that they trust those people. And here's Christopher wrapping all this up in one of the interviews. He's a 41-year-old. He says, I don't tend to trust authority figures. I would definitely be more likely to listen to someone who I felt was listening to how I was feeling or my particular problem than some expert who might be talking about generalized things, or their knowledge might not be might be totally wrong or not relevant to me in that sense. So he's saying, I trust people who can help me and who, because they understand me or can give me information because, that is relevant to my situation because they've taken the time to listen to me. All throughout the data, what we've been seeing all season is that listening builds trust. Listening builds trust. Listening builds trust. And it's exactly that kind of trust that we need right now, because our other pathways to trust have been cut off.
Yeah.
Right. It used to be that if you were a pastor, you just got trust, right?
Well, yeah.
That's not the case anymore.
You're right. You're right. Man, I feel like thinking about this and everything you said, and just in general, man, about this aspect, people are just, I feel like, have been let down by people that they've looked up to. Offices that were once prestigious in the eyes of the people, and even the children revered, like, man, I want to be that. And I think, in that aspect, when people are in those places and they fail, they're human, right? But that translates to, like, man, I can't trust someone like that. Someone who has information, someone who has a truth, who has knowledge. It's hard to trust them because I don't know them. You just never know.
And they don't know me.
And they don't know me.
Yeah.
Right? They haven't listened to me. And that's why we have high trust with people that we're in relationship with, because more times than not, they've listened to us and they've taken time to spend with us and to do life with us. And that's where the trust comes, right? Trust is gained in drops and it's lost in buckets, but we got to keep dropping. We got to keep dropping the time. We got to keep being consistent in that way, because that's important. And so it's important to be a part of a part of communities that foster unity and belonging and care. And I think ministries that do that, like I say, from the top down, I've said this earlier in an early episode, if there's a leader that's in place that has a staff or people that they've put around them to make sure that we are the hands and feet of Jesus, right? And then we are the hands and feet and the ear of the ministry, so that way we can hear what's happening with the people that we're serving in the community. When I'm a part of that, I feel like I belong. I feel seen. I feel known. I feel heard, even if I'm not fully agreed with, in a way. But yeah, this is big stuff, man.
I think that was actually one of the really interesting things about this for me, is that we didn't find, and in other research that I've done too, I don't find evidence from teenagers or adults saying, in order for me to trust somebody, I need to know that we agree on all the issues.
Yes.
Right. You do hear consistently, I need to know that I'm heard.
Right.
That it doesn't mean they have to like it. It doesn't mean they have to agree with it. We can disagree on things.
Right.
But, and some of those, there may be deal breaker issues. People, like, I get that, like, especially things that are closely related to your identity. If it's, if it's something that is true about who you are and somebody else is not willing to accept that, I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not sure how much trust you're ever going to have for that kind of person.
Yeah.
Right. And that just may be the reality. There may just, it may not be possible for everybody in every situation. Yeah. But that thing that you said about being, like, that this starts with leadership. Daria, 27-year-old that we interviewed for this, she said, I don't think you can be a good leader if you're a bad listener.
Man.
I don't think you can be a good leader if you're a bad listener.
Man.
But what I think is amazing? So she says that, and I was like, what a great way of saying that. I'm not surprised. Like, it's not eye-opening to me. That is how I would expect a 27-year-old. But then I started thinking about it as, like, what if she had said that 30 years ago? Nobody was saying that 30 years ago.
No one.
What? You know what I mean? Like,
right. Man. Yeah.
I mean, it just wasn't how we thought about leadership. So when you think about ministry, Keedren, I mean, we can think about these very traditional sort of programmatic, like, essentially this train is leaving the station. It's going with or without you. Like, this is the plan for the school year, or the ministry year, whatever we've got. Like, If 5 people show up, we're doing this. If 50 people show up, we're doing this.
Sure.
That does not sound like the way that you all do ministry at your place. So tell me a little bit about how this kind of shift towards relationships has impacted the approach that you all take.
We are a relationship-centered family ministry, right? We put the relationship at the center of every interaction. It's personal. We make it personal with our families, from check-in, from whenever we see them on campus or even in the community. We place the relationship at the center of every interaction. So we want to make sure that when we interact with them, when they leave from us, that the relationship is better, right? Or the same, never, lesser than, regardless if there's an issue that they may have with us or with someone else, if it came to that, or maybe there's a lack of understanding, we listen, but the relationship is currency to us,
Yeah.
And so that's how we look at it. Each Sunday we want to make, not even just Sunday, it's a lifestyle. It really is. And so I think as we look at it that way and as we have lived that out, it's just become the culture. But it starts with what you think, right? It starts with what you think about it. Is relationships important? Do you feel like it's important? If it is, then that's when we'll start. That'll change the way, we talk, right? It'll change the way, the habits that we, that we have. It'll change the systems. It'll impact the systems that may eventually change to actually create the culture that is relationship centered. And I think that's how we have done and that what we're doing. Like I said, we're still growing and evolving in that way. And that's really the heart of how we do things and how I want to continue to encourage leaders in ministry and business and families to move that way, because that's important, to be able to have that trust. Ultimately, the truth will matter more when trust is, what's the word? When we have trust, the truth just matters more. We see that. I know I've seen that even in, let's say gang culture or just, right? Because I feel like you guys trust me. I mean, I trust y'all because of the time I spent with y'all. I feel heard, like I feel like I belong. So even though what you tell me, like I know it's wrong to go do X, Y, Z, but the fact that I've built trust with you guys and y'all showed up and you are down for me, so to speak.
Right.
Your truth, to me, it is real because you were real with me. Right. And so that's why it's important for us to spend time and to be truthful, to be honest, to be real, to be relatable, right? To be reliable, to be curious, because the truth and the trust actually is developed from that, so whether you're the lead of a corporation, you're an educator, you're a family man or woman, making sure that you spend the time intentionally, with your people to build that truth, to build that trust. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And the truth matters more. So,
well, I think this can be so hard for people in leadership to understand, because they think, when I would share some of these data early on a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, I would say, look, you gotta be in a relationship with people. You gotta listen to them, so that way they'll know that you have their best intentions, or you have the best intentions, that you have their best interests in mind.
Yeah.
And you say, what are you talking about? Like, we have spent X number of dollars. Like, we spent all this time. I went and got this degree so I could get this job. Like, shouldn't that all be enough to demonstrate that I genuinely care and have their best intentions, or the best interests in mind? And I said, it should. I think I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
That's the story you tell.
Yeah.
Right? But the story they're telling is that you care about this institution. And so their assumption is that everything you do is for the best interests of the institution. Unless they know you, unless they know that you know them, and then they can start to shift that narrative. But in this low trust world, they keep telling themselves this story that, okay, well, institutions, are terrible. I can't trust them to do what's best for me because they've let all these people down over all this period of time. You work for the institution. You must be doing what's good for the institution. And until I see otherwise, that's how I'm going to rock and roll through the world. And so even if it's not true, that story that they're telling themselves really does matter. And relationships rooted in listening help to undo all of that. It's like the antidote for this collapse of institutional trust is rebuilding trust through relationships. Is I think really critical for people in ministry to understand.
I agree. Having a system where you can hear people, where you can listen to them, even if it's on a big scale, like where are we, what are we doing to hear from our people? And then when we do, let's say you put a survey out, what are we doing with that information? Are they seeing results? Are you even referring back to that?
Yeah.
We heard you, y'all were
not going to do anything differently. But
but that matters, right? It's like, putting a system in place for us to hear from people, but then also following up and making sure that they know that you've heard them. And I'll tell you this, and we can move on. But even when we have meetings, I learned this from my wife. Sometimes people have ideas, and it's just like, I'm going to hear you. We may not be able to do everything or any of these things, depending on what it is. Mm-hmm. I at least want to hear you all, and we can see. And it may not be a no. It may not be a no. It may just be a not right now. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so, but having those conversations proactively are that's important. So yeah. That's key.
All right, we've got one episode left from this season. We're going to come back in the next episode and talk about big takeaways. Keedren, I'm curious about your thoughts now from this whole season of talking about these data and your own ministry and approach and thoughts there. So we'll share some big conclusions and takeaways from this as we wrap up this first season of the Future of Faith podcast. This has been I can't believe we're at the end of this.
Man, I know. Man. Beautiful journey, man. Wow.
Yes. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Cool.
Love it.